The morning mist clung to Thornfield Manor like a shroud, curling around the ancient stone turrets and settling into the hollows of the overgrown gardens with the weight of centuries. Lady Celestia Ashworth, no, she must remember. Lady Celestia Blackwood now, Duchess of Thornfield, stood at the rain-streaked window of her new chambers, watching the grey autumn landscape blur into indistinct shapes through glass that seemed to separate her from the world beyond, with more than mere transparency. 3 days had passed since the wedding, 3 days since she had arrived at this imposing estate with its cold corridors and colder silence, and already she felt the walls closing around her like the tightening of a fist. The journey from her father's modest country house had been mercifully brief. The Duke, her husband, though the word felt foreign on her tongue, riding ahead on his stallion while she followed in the carriage, alone with her thoughts and the secret that coiled in her chest like a serpent waiting to strike. Her mother, God rest her soul, had made Celestia promise to never speak of it. The affliction that had plagued her since childhood fever had burned through her small body at the age of 7, leaving her with episodes that came without warning, stealing consciousness and control, rendering her helpless and vulnerable. Madness, the physicians had whispered when they thought her too young to understand. Possession, the local vicar had suggested with barely concealed disgust. But her mother had known better, had recognized it as something medical, something manageable, something that need not define her daughter's entire existence if only it could remain hidden. And so Celestia had learned to live with her secret, to recognize the warning signs, the strange metallic taste on her tongue, the peculiar shimmer at the edges of her vision, the sudden feeling of displacement, as though her soul was being pulled from her body by invisible hands. She had learned to excuse herself, to find privacy, to wake alone and trembling on the floor of her locked bedroom, grateful that no one had witnessed her shame. But now, bound in matrimony to a man who regarded her with the warmth of winter stone, she wondered how long her careful facade could endure. Breakfast that morning had been an exercise in excruciating formality. The Duke seated at one end of the enormous mahogany table, she at the other, an expanse of polished wood between them that might as well have been an ocean. He had inquired about her comfort with the detached courtesy one might show a stranger at an inn, his dark eyes never quite meeting hers, his attention devoted to the correspondence stacked beside his plate. Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Thornfield, was a figure carved from granite and duty, his jaw set in permanent severity, his shoulders bearing the weight of ancient title and expectation with rigid formality. The marriage had been arranged, of course, negotiated between her father and the Duke's solicitors with the cold efficiency of a business transaction, her modest dowry exchanged for the prestige of a ducal alliance, both families satisfied with the arrangement, if not precisely jubilant. Celestia had harbored no romantic illusions, but neither had she anticipated this profound isolation, this sense of being utterly alone, despite the servants who moved like ghosts through the corridors and the husband who slept in chambers 3 doors distant from her own. Now, as she traced patterns in the condensation on the window glass, she felt the familiar tremor of anxiety in her hands and wondered desperately whether she should tell him, whether honesty might build a bridge across the chasm between them, or whether revelation would only deepen the distance, transforming his indifference into something far worse, disgust, or worse still, fear. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The library became Celestia's refuge, a sanctuary of leather-bound volumes and the musty perfume of aged paper, where tall windows filtered the pale afternoon light through leaded glass and cast geometric shadows across the Persian carpet. It was here, 3 days after her arrival at Thornfield, that the inevitable occurred, the warning signs arriving with their familiar dread, the metallic taste flooding her mouth, the world tilting sideways as though the very foundations of the manor had shifted beneath her feet, the peculiar sensation of her consciousness fragmenting like light through a prism. She had just enough time to recognize what was coming, to sink gratefully into the high-backed chair near the fireplace rather than collapsing onto the unforgiving floor, before darkness claimed her with the inexorable pull of tide drawing sand into the sea. When awareness returned, creeping back in fragments and disconnected sensations, she found herself still in the chair, her limbs heavy and unresponsive, her tongue thick in her mouth, but something was different, something that sent ice flooding through her veins, despite the warmth of the room. A blanket had been draped carefully over her shoulders, its soft wool foreign against her skin, its presence irrefutable evidence that someone had witnessed her vulnerability and had seen her in that helpless state she had guarded so desperately. Panic rose sharp and acidic in her throat as she clutched the blanket with trembling fingers, her eyes darting around the empty library, searching shadows for the observer who had left this damning kindness. No one emerged from behind the towering shelves. No footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond, but the blanket remained, tangible proof that her secret had been discovered, that the careful fortress of normalcy she had constructed around herself had been breached. The days that followed were colored by paranoia and dread, every servant's glance seeming weighted with knowledge, every whispered conversation between maids falling silent as she passed, becoming evidence of her exposure. Adrian grew more distant still, if such a thing were possible, taking his meals in his study, leaving for London on estate business without informing her of his departure, returning days later without acknowledgement of his absence. She found herself remembering their courtship with painful clarity, those brief weeks before the wedding when he had called upon her at her father's house with something approaching warmth in his severe features, when he had asked her opinions on literature and listened to her thoughts on the paintings in her father's modest gallery, when she had glimpsed beneath his austere exterior a man capable of thoughtfulness, perhaps even tenderness. That man had vanished the moment the wedding vows were spoken, replaced by this cold stranger who moved through Thornfield like a ghost, haunting his own estate. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, began appearing at odd moments with concerned inquiries about Celestia's health, her kind eyes searching Celestia's face with an intensity that suggested she knew more than she revealed, and when Celestia assured her that all was well, the older woman's expression betrayed gentle disbelief. Seeking distraction from her mounting anxiety, Celestia began exploring the manor's labyrinthine corridors, discovering rooms filled with dust-shrouded furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her progress with judgment. It was during one such exploration that she found the East Wing, its entrance marked by an ornate door of dark oak fitted with an iron lock, the handle refusing to yield when she tested it, the keyhole revealing nothing but darkness beyond. When she inquired about it at dinner that evening, one of the rare meals Adrian deigned to share with her, he had looked up from his plate with an expression she could not decipher, something between wariness and sorrow, before informing her in clipped tones that the East Wing was closed, unsafe for habitation, not to be entered under any circumstances, and she had nodded her acceptance while filing away the strange intensity of his response, wondering what secrets Thornfield kept locked away in its forbidden spaces, never suspecting that soon she would discover the answer from within those very walls. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon, grey and unremarkable, the kind of day that should have passed into memory without consequence, but instead carved itself into Celestia's soul with the sharp edges of catastrophe. She had been in the music room, attempting to find solace in the pianoforte, though her fingers stumbled over keys she had once played with confidence, when the warning signs arrived with their terrible familiarity, and the metallic taste and the tilting world and the fragmenting consciousness, and she had barely managed to sink onto the velvet bench before darkness claimed her, swallowing her whole as it always did, and indifferent to her fear or her circumstance. When she woke, disoriented and heavy-limbed, she found Adrian standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the corridor's lamplight, his face a mask of something she could not decipher, not disgust as she had feared, but something colder, more calculating, the expression of a man confronting an equation that refused to balance. He did not speak immediately, merely watched her with those dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every tremor of her hands, every irregular breath, every sign of the vulnerability she had fought so desperately to conceal. And when he finally moved, it was with measured steps that brought him no closer than the threshold, as though crossing into the room might contaminate him with whatever affliction he believed plagued her. His voice, when it came, was devoid of warmth or sympathy, each word precisely chosen and coldly delivered. "How long have you concealed this affliction from me, madam?" The formality of the address struck her like a physical blow, the distance of madam when he should have called her Celestia, or perhaps even wife if he could not manage tenderness, and she struggled to find words that might explain, that might bridge the chasm opening between them with terrible speed. "Your Grace, I can explain. It is not what you think. It is a medical condition from childhood fever. My mother consulted physicians who assured her, but he raised one hand, silencing her with a gesture as imperious as it was dismissive, his jaw tight with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. She could not tell which, could not read the emotions flickering behind his carefully controlled expression. "I have no interest in explanations fabricated to justify deception," he said, his tone suggesting she had committed some unforgivable betrayal rather than simply protected herself from judgment she had every reason to expect. "You entered into this marriage under false pretenses, concealing a condition that any man of honor should have been informed of before vows were exchanged." She wanted to argue, to point out that their marriage had been arranged by others, that he had never asked about her health or shown interest in knowing her beyond the superficial requirements of courtship, and that her mother had advised this secrecy precisely because men like him would react with exactly this cold condemnation. But the words died in her throat beneath the weight of his gaze, and she found herself unable to defend against accusations that felt both unjust and somehow inevitable. That evening, after hours of silence during which she waited in her chambers with mounting dread, Adrian summoned her to his study, the room lined with law books and smelling of leather and tobacco, where he informed her with the detached efficiency of a magistrate pronouncing sentence that for her own protection and the preservation of the family's reputation, she would be relocated to the East Wing, that a physician would be consulted regarding treatment options, that she would receive every comfort but would not be permitted to move freely about the manor or receive visitors until her condition could be properly assessed and managed. The word "managed" landed like a stone in still water, its implications rippling outward with terrible clarity. And as Dr. Whitmore arrived the following day with his bag of antiquated instruments and his questions about her spiritual state, about whether she had experienced visions or heard voices, about her mother's moral character, and whether madness ran in her family line, Celestia understood with sinking horror that Adrian did not see her affliction as the medical condition her mother's physicians had described, but as something far more sinister, something that required not treatment but containment, not understanding but control. And she realized that the man she had married, the Duke, who now stood with Dr. Whitmore discussing her fate as though she were not present in the room, believed her not ill but possessed, not suffering but dangerous, and that the prison of the East Wing awaited her not as temporary refuge, but as permanent exile from the life she had barely begun to imagine might someday become her own. The East Wing chambers were beautiful in the way a gilded cage might be beautiful, all damask wallpaper in shades of cream and gold, velvet curtains heavy enough to block out both light and hope, furniture carved from mahogany and upholstered in silk that whispered luxury while speaking nothing of freedom. They moved her belongings on a grey afternoon, while she stood silent witness to her own exile, watching footmen carry her trunks through corridors she would no longer be permitted to traverse, her wedding trousseau unpacked in rooms that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum for the life she had barely begun to imagine. Adrian came once, on that first evening, standing in the doorway with the same careful distance he had maintained since the music room, his expression unreadable as he informed her in tones devoid of warmth that this arrangement was temporary, that Dr. Whitmore was consulting colleagues in London about treatment options that she would want for nothing in terms of material comfort, and she had listened to these assurances that felt more like lies, noting how he would not meet her eyes, how his hands clasped behind his back betrayed tension in their rigid stillness, how he spoke of her comfort while denying her the most basic freedom of movement beyond these ornate walls. He left without waiting for response, the key turning in the lock behind him with a sound that echoed through the silence like a death knell, and she stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by beauty that meant nothing, understanding with crystalline clarity that she had been transformed from duchess to prisoner in the space of days, her husband become her jailer, her new home become her cell. Only Mrs. Hartwell and a young maid named Lily were permitted to attend her, bringing meals on silver trays and speaking in hushed tones as though she were an invalid rather than a woman of sound mind, trapped by her husband's misguided fear. And while Mrs. Hartwell's eyes held sympathy that suggested she disagreed with this arrangement, She was nevertheless bound by the Duke's orders, her kindness constrained by duty to a master whose word was law within these walls. Weeks passed in a blur of sameness, each day indistinguishable from the last, measured only by the changing light through windows that overlooked gardens she could see but not touch, their autumn beauty turning to winter bareness, while she remained locked away like some shameful secret the family wished to forget. She was permitted no visitors, no correspondence. Her requests to write to her aunt or her childhood friend met with polite refusal. Mrs. Hartwell explaining with apologetic firmness that the Duke had forbidden all contact with the outside world until her condition improved, though what improvement he sought remained maddeningly unclear, since he never visited to assess her state, never sent word of his expectations. He never acknowledged her existence beyond ensuring she was fed and clothed and kept in isolation. In desperation, she turned to painting, requesting supplies through Mrs. Hartwell and receiving them with surprising swiftness, perhaps the one request Adrian felt safe to grant, and she set up her easel before the window, capturing on canvas the landscapes of freedom she could not have, the gardens she could observe but not walk through, the distant moors visible beyond Thornfield's grounds, where wild things roamed unconfined. She painted the garden obsessively, every tree and path and flower bed committed to canvas in oils that smelled of linseed and turpentine, scents that reminded her of her mother's studio, and of afternoons spent watching her paint before fever took her, before Celestia was left alone with a secret she had guarded too well and not well enough. Adrian's portrait hung on the wall facing her bed, a formal painting done before their marriage, his severe features captured in oils by some society artist who had made him handsome but cold, and one morning after a particularly difficult seizure left her weak and despairing, she rose and turned the portrait to face the wall, unable to bear the painted eyes that seemed to judge her as the living man had judged her, finding her wanting, finding her dangerous, finding her unworthy of the trust and partnership marriage should have granted, and the blank rectangle of wallpaper where the portrait had hung became a daily reminder of everything she had lost before she had ever truly possessed it. Months passed with the slow inevitability of seasons turning, autumn's golden decay surrendering to winter's stark bareness, the gardens below her window stripped of their finery until only bare branches remained, like skeletal fingers reaching toward a grey sky that seemed to mirror the emptiness of her days, and through it all Celestia remained confined to the east wing. Her world contracted to these elegant rooms that grew more suffocating with each passing week. Despite their beauty, despite the fire always burning in the grate, and the meals delivered punctually, and the fresh linens that appeared as if by magic while she slept. Her seizures continued with their unpredictable rhythm, striking without warning and leaving her depleted. But she learned through painful experience to recognize the warning signs more quickly, to position herself safely when the metallic taste bloomed on her tongue, to breathe through the aftermath with less panic than before, her body adapting to what her mind still fought to accept as permanent companion rather than temporary affliction. Lily became more than servant during those long months, the young maid's initial nervousness giving way to genuine companionship as she brought not only tea and fresh candles, but news from the world beyond, Celestia's prison, whispered reports of village happenings and estate business, careful mentions of the Duke's activities that Celestia both craved and dreaded hearing. Through Lily's accounts, delivered while arranging Celestia's hair or turning down the bed, she learned that Adrian had informed society his Duchess was delicate and recovering in the countryside, a convenient fiction that preserved reputation while condemning her to this elegant exile, and the lie stung more than truth might have. The implication that she was too fragile for the world when it was the world, or at least her husband's fear of it, that had made her so. Dr. Whitmore continued his weekly visits, arriving with his black bag and his useless tonics that tasted of bitter herbs and accomplished nothing, asking the same questions about her spiritual state and her mother's character, scribbling notes in a leather journal while treating her with the patronizing gentleness one might show a child or an imbecile, and she endured these examinations because she had no choice, swallowing the tonics that did nothing because refusal would only confirm whatever suspicions already festered in his narrow mind. It was during one of these visits, while Dr. Whitmore consulted with Mrs. Hartwell in the sitting room adjacent to her bedchamber, that Celestia heard voices raised in the corridor beyond, Adrian's deep tones, and a woman's imperious contralto that could only belong to the Dowager Duchess, his mother, whom Celestia had met only twice before her confinement, and who had regarded her with the cool assessment of one examining livestock at market. She pressed herself against the door, separating her from the corridor, shame at eavesdropping overwhelmed by desperate hunger for information. For any glimpse into the mind of the man who had locked her away, and through the heavy wood she heard the Dowager's cutting pronouncement that this situation was untenable, that Adrian should seek annulment on grounds of concealment, that the family could not afford the scandal of a mad duchess hidden away like some Gothic horror. And Celestia's heart contracted with fear at how easily she might be discarded, how fragile her position truly was, despite the marriage vows barely 2 months old. But Adrian's response, when it came, surprised her with its firmness, his refusal delivered in tones that brooked no argument, though when his mother demanded to know why he would not rid himself of a wife who brought only trouble and shame, he offered no explanation. Only silence that stretched long enough for Celestia to imagine the Dowager's frustrated expression before footsteps retreated down the corridor, leaving only questions and the faint hope that perhaps her husband's motivations were more complex than simple cruelty. Though what those motivations might be remained as locked away as she was, hidden behind walls she could not breach, and a silence that spoke volumes while revealing nothing at all. Christmas arrived at Thornfield Manor like a mockery wrapped in evergreen and red ribbon, the servants decorating the great hall with holly and mistletoe, while Celestia remained locked away in her beautiful prison, watching through frost-etched windows as wreaths were hung on doors she could not pass through, as carriages arrived bearing guests she would not meet, as life continued in the great house as though she did not exist within its walls. Adrian sent gifts on Christmas morning, delivered by Mrs. Hartwell with apologetic eyes, boxes wrapped in silver paper containing a cashmere shawl soft as cloud, kid leather gloves dyed the color of spring violets, a strand of pearls that gleamed with cold perfection in the winter light, and Celestia accepted these offerings with numb gratitude, understanding they were substitutes for the presents he would not grant, tokens meant to assuage guilt or demonstrate remembrance, or perhaps simply to maintain the fiction that she was cared for, even as she remained abandoned. She wore none of them, leaving the pearls in their velvet case and the shawl folded in tissue, unable to bear the weight of gifts given without the courage to face the recipient, and instead she sat at her writing desk and composed letters she could not send, pouring onto paper all the words that had accumulated in her throat during months of enforced silence, writing to her aunt, who surely wondered at her absence from the family's Christmas gathering, to her childhood friend who had promised to visit after the wedding and been denied without explanation, to Adrian himself, though she knew he would never read the words she penned in careful script on cream vellum. Through Lily, who brought her Christmas dinner on a tray laden with roasted goose and plum pudding that Celestia could barely taste for the loneliness that seasoned every bite, she learned that Adrian had attended Christmas services alone, that he had hosted a small dinner for neighboring families, but retired early pleading business concerns, that he spent his days locked in his study with estate ledgers and parliamentary papers, throwing himself into work with the same obsessive dedication he had shown when locking her away, and Celestia understood with painful clarity that they were both prisoners now, she of his making and he of his own fears, both isolated and suffering, though only she bore the physical constraint of locked doors. It was Mrs. Hartwell who finally offered the key that began to unlock understanding, the housekeeper arriving one grey afternoon between Christmas and New Year with fresh linens and a pot of tea, settling into the chair across from Celestia with unusual familiarity and speaking words that had clearly been held back for too long, revealing that Adrian's younger sister Isabel had died of fever when she was 7 years old, and he was 12, that he had sat at her bedside for days, watching helplessly as the fever consumed her, that their mother had never recovered from the loss, and their father had grown distant and cold, that Adrian had learned in childhood that loving someone meant watching them suffer and being powerless to prevent it, that illness was an enemy against which all his privilege and position and power meant nothing. And suddenly Celestia saw her husband not as cruel jailer, but as wounded boy grown into frightened man, his actions born not from malice, but from the terrible logic of trauma, his attempt to protect her through isolation, actually a desperate bid to control what he had once been helpless to prevent. And though this understanding did not excuse what he had done, or erase the months of loneliness she had endured, it transformed her anger into something more complex, a mixture of compassion and grief for the child who had learned all the wrong lessons about love and loss, about protection and control, about the price of caring when the world could so easily take away everything you held dear. The new year arrived not with celebration but with crisis, the winter's bitter cold settling into Celestia's bones in the days after Christmas until she woke one morning with fever burning through her veins and her head pounding with an ache that made the grey light filtering through her the window feel like daggers piercing her skull, and she tried to rise from bed, only to find her legs would not support her weight, her body trembling with weakness that went beyond the usual aftermath of her seizures. Lily found her collapsed on the floor beside the bed where she had fallen, the young maid's frightened cry bringing Mrs. Hartwell rushing into the room with skirts flying and alarm written across her weathered features, and within hours Dr. Whitmore arrived with his black bag and his grave expression, examining Celestia with hands that felt too cold against her burning skin, while pronouncing that she had contracted influenza and that her weakened constitution made the prognosis uncertain, the words floating through Celestia's consciousness like debris on dark water, half heard and not fully comprehended through the fever that was rapidly consuming her ability to grasp anything beyond the immediate sensations of heat and cold warring in her flesh. The seizure struck that evening with unusual violence, her body convulsing while fever raged unchecked, and when consciousness returned, she found herself in a twilight state between waking and dreams, awareness fragmenting into moments of lucidity, followed by long stretches where past and present blurred together, and she could not distinguish between the East Wing bedroom and her childhood nursery, between Mrs. Hartwell's worried face and her mother's beloved features, between the present illness and the childhood fever that had first marked her with this affliction she carried still. Doctor Whitmore spoke of brain fever with the hushed tones reserved for death sentences, and though Celestia could not hold on to the words she understood from the physician's expression and Mrs. Hartwell's tears that she was in grave danger, that the combination of influenza and seizure had brought her to a precipice from which she might not return, and somewhere in the fog of fever she felt more resignation than fear, a quiet acceptance that perhaps this elegant prison would become her tomb, that Adrian would finally be free of the inconvenient wife he had locked away, that her story would end here in these beautiful rooms that had held her captive for months that felt like years. It was Mrs. Hartwell who defied Adrian's standing orders, who sent a footman racing through winter darkness to summon the Duke from whatever business kept him occupied in his study, and when Adrian arrived in the East Wing for the first time since he had imprisoned Celestia there, he found his wife unconscious and fever-ravaged, her dark hair spread across pillows damp with sweat, her skin alternating between burning heat and violent chills, her breathing shallow and labored, and something in his carefully constructed walls cracked at the sight of her so diminished, so fragile, so perilously close to the death he had spent his life fearing. For 3 days he maintained vigil at her bedside, refusing food and sleep, changing the cool cloths on her forehead with his own hands, holding her steady through seizures that racked her weakened body, listening as delirium loosened her tongue and she spoke aloud thoughts she had never voiced in health, and through her fevered rambling he heard everything he had refused to hear before, her mother's careful instructions about managing the seizures, the medical nature of her condition as opposed to madness or possession, the loneliness of her confinement and the betrayal of his abandonment, the letters she had written that he would never read, the understanding she had gained of his fear even as it destroyed her hope, and with each revelation, Adrian felt the weight of what he had done settle more heavily on shoulders that had never before bent under the burden of genuine remorse, the terrible knowledge that in trying to protect her from imagined dangers, he had created real suffering, that his fear had been the true affliction all along, more destructive than any seizure, more imprisoning than any locked door, and as dawn broke on the 4th day and Celestia's fever finally broke with it, he remained at her bedside, weeping silently for the wife he had wronged and the time he could never reclaim, and the man he had allowed fear to make him become. Celestia woke to watery winter sunlight filtering through the East Wing windows and the unfamiliar sensation of a hand holding hers, her fevered dreams receding slowly to reveal Adrian slumped in the chair beside her bed, his face haggard with exhaustion and marked by several days' growth of beard, his elegant clothes rumpled and his hair disheveled in a way she had never seen. And for a moment she thought this too must be delirium, another fever dream conjuring what could not be real. But then his eyes opened at her slight movement, and she saw in their grey depths something she had never witnessed before, a raw vulnerability that made him look younger and more lost than any duke should ever appear. He straightened slowly, releasing her hand as though uncertain of his right to hold it, and spoke her name with a roughness that suggested how rarely his voice had been used for anything beyond necessary commands to servants during his vigil, asking how she felt with a concern that seemed to pain him to express. And Celestia found she had no words adequate to the strangeness of this moment, no response that could encompass the weeks of isolation followed by this unexpected attendance. So she simply said she was better, and watched as relief and something darker, perhaps shame, crossed his features in rapid succession. The apology came haltingly, Adrian rising from his chair to stand at the window with his back to her as though he could not bear to meet her eyes while confessing what he had done. His words carefully chosen but inadequate to the magnitude of his transgression, speaking of fear and failure and the terrible realization that had come to him as he watched her hover between life and death, that he had imprisoned her not for her protection but for his own, that he had heard in her delirium all the truths he had refused to hear in health. And Celestia listened with a confusion of emotions warring in her weakened chest, anger still present, but undermined by the evidence of his genuine torment. The understanding Mrs. Hartwell had provided about his sister's death lending context if not excuse to his actions, and when he finally turned to face her, she saw that he had been weeping, this proud man reduced to tears by the recognition of what his fear had wrought. He asked, voice barely above a whisper, if he might be permitted to visit her daily, not as jailer but as husband attempting to know the wife he had wronged, and though every injured part of her soul cried out to refuse him, to punish him with the same isolation he had imposed upon her, Celestia found herself agreeing cautiously and setting boundaries even as she opened a door, saying he might visit in the afternoons if she felt well enough to receive him, and so began the slow reconstruction of what had been shattered before it was ever truly built. Adrian arriving each day with offerings that spoke of genuine effort to understand her, books he thought she might enjoy, newspapers so she might know what occurred beyond her walls, and gradually their conversations warmed from stiff formality to something approaching real exchange. He reading aloud while she regained her strength, she showing him the paintings that had been her sole companion during her confinement, and when his gaze fell upon his own portrait turned to face the wall, she watched painful recognition dawn across his features, the silent testimony of her rejection, more eloquent than any accusation she might have spoken, and in that moment she saw him truly comprehend what he had done, not in abstract terms of wrongness, but in the specific, personal devastation of having lost her regard before he had ever truly won it. And something in his stricken expression told her that this loss mattered to him in ways she had not imagined possible, that beneath his cold exterior had always lived the capacity to care, and slowly, carefully, like two strangers learning a new language, they began the tentative work of knowing each other as they should have from the beginning, building understanding from the ruins of their disastrous start. Spring arrived with the tentative promise of renewal, snowdrops pushing through thawing earth and early crocuses dotting the gardens that Celestia could now see from windows she was permitted to open, Adrian's daily visits having become the rhythm by which she measured her days, and on an afternoon, when pale sunshine streamed through the east wing windows, and the air carried the first real warmth after winter's grip, she felt the familiar aura that preceded a seizure, that strange displacement of consciousness she had learned to recognize as warning, and she had only time to turn toward Adrian, who sat reading aloud from a volume of poetry before the convulsion seized her, her body no longer her own, as muscles contracted beyond her control, and awareness fractured into darkness, shot through with fragmentary sensations. When consciousness returned, bringing with it the usual disorientation and the leaden exhaustion that always followed, she found Adrian still there, not fled in horror, as she had half expected, despite their weeks of careful reconstruction, but kneeling beside the settee where she had fallen, his hand holding hers with a steadiness that spoke of deliberate choice rather than mere duty, and in his eyes She saw not the fear or disgust that had driven him to imprison her, but something softer, a concerned tenderness that made her throat tighten with emotions too complex to name, relief and gratitude, and a cautious hope that perhaps he truly had changed, that the man who had locked her away was being replaced by someone capable of staying, of bearing witness to her affliction, without making it the sum total of her worth. He helped her to sit upright slowly, retrieving the cushion that had fallen to the floor and tucking it behind her back with a care that felt almost reverent. And then he spoke words she had never imagined hearing from him, a confession that tumbled out as though long damned, telling her of his sister Charlotte, who had been 7 years old when fever claimed her, how he had been 12 and helpless, watching her convulse and burn and fade over the course of 3 terrible days, how their mother had collapsed into grief so profound she never fully emerged, how their father had aged decades in those months that followed, and how Adrian had vowed never to love anyone again because loving meant losing, and losing meant destruction of everything remaining. And when he had married Celestia and seen her first seizure, he had panicked, the past rising up to swallow reason. And in his irrational terror he had thought that isolation could protect her, that if he kept her separate from his heart, she could not wound it. But he had realized during her illness that hearts do not obey such commands, that he had come to care for her despite his best efforts to remain distant, and that in trying to protect her, he had instead imprisoned her, trading her freedom for his illusory safety. And he was more sorry than language could adequately express. Knowing apology could not restore what he had stolen. Those months of her life spent locked away like some shameful secret, when she deserved to be honored, known, allowed the dignity of managing her own condition, as she had done before their marriage. Celestia listened with tears sliding down her cheeks, seeing his genuine remorse in every line of his haggard face, understanding at last the depth of the fear that had driven him, and recognizing too that understanding was not the same as absolution, that she could see the wound that had shaped his cruelty while still carrying the scars of what that cruelty had inflicted upon her. And when he finished speaking, she told him quietly that she saw his pain and his regret, but that the hurt he had caused ran deep, that trust once shattered was not easily rebuilt, that she would need time to reconcile the man who sat before her now with the one who had condemned her to isolation. And he nodded acceptance of this truth, asking nothing more than the chance to prove through actions what words alone could never accomplish. And in the silence that followed, she felt something shift between them. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but the first fragile possibility of it, a crack in the wall of her justified anger through which light might eventually stream. Adrian disappeared to London the following week, leaving Celestia with only a brief note explaining his purpose. And when he returned 5 days later, he brought with him not gifts or apologies, but knowledge, armfuls of medical texts and correspondence from physicians who specialized in disorders of the nervous system, doctors who understood that seizures were not manifestations of madness or moral failing, but rather disruptions in the body's electrical processes, manageable conditions that required understanding rather than imprisonment, and he spread these materials before her in the East Wing sitting room, with an urgency that spoke of sleepless nights spent reading, learning, attempting to comprehend what he should have sought to understand from the beginning. Celestia watched him explain his findings with a mixture of emotions too complex to untangle, moved by the evident effort he had expended, the genuine desire to educate himself about her condition, yet simultaneously wounded by the reminder that all this information had been available to him before, that had he listened when she tried to tell him, had he trusted her understanding of her own body, months of isolation might have been avoided. And when he finished his earnest recitation, she told him quietly that she had tried to explain this very thing, that her mother had consulted specialists who confirmed her seizures were a residual effect of childhood fever, neither progressive nor indicative of mental deterioration, and she watched his face fall as he recognized the truth of her words, the failure of listening that had preceded his failure of action. He sank into the chair across from her, the medical texts suddenly seeming to weigh upon him like physical burdens, and asked in a voice stripped of ducal authority what she needed from him now, what would help her feel less like a prisoner and more like a woman with agency over her own life. And Celestia considered the question carefully before answering, knowing that her response would shape whatever future they might build together. And finally she said simply, freedom and trust. The two things he had denied her, the foundations without which no relationship could stand. And she watched understanding dawn across his features as he comprehended what she asked. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the basic dignities he should never have taken. The right to move through her own home unconfined, the right to be believed about her own condition, the right to make choices about her own care and her own days. That very afternoon Adrian summoned Mrs. Hartwell and instructed her to unlock all the east wing doors, to remove any barriers between Celestia and the rest of the manor, declaring that his wife was free to go wherever she wished within Thornfield and its grounds, and Celestia stood in the doorway of her chambers, watching him turn the key in the lock one final time. This gesture of liberation that should have filled her with joy, but instead left her oddly paralyzed, uncertain after months of confinement, how to navigate freedom, what to do with these open doors and unlocked possibilities. And when Adrian gestured for her to precede him into the corridor, she found herself hesitating, not because she wished to remain imprisoned, but because the prison had become familiar, and freedom felt suddenly vast and terrifying. And she realized with some surprise that unlocking doors was the easier part, that learning to walk through them freely would require more courage than either of them had anticipated, and that the keys to her physical liberation had been his to turn, but the keys to her emotional freedom would take far longer to forge. The first morning Celestia ventured beyond the east wing into the main house felt both monumental and strangely anticlimactic, her footsteps echoing through marble corridors that had been forbidden territory for so many months, and she found the servants kind in their greetings, though their eyes held undisguised curiosity, questions they were too well trained to voice, but that hung in the air nonetheless as she passed, and Mrs. Hartwell appeared at intervals with subtle offers of assistance that felt more like quiet encouragement, as though the housekeeper understood that reclaiming one's home after imprisonment required a particular species of courage that had nothing to do with physical bravery and everything to do with refusing to let fear win. That evening, Adrian sent a formal request through his valet, asking if Celestia would join him for dinner in the main dining room. The formality of the invitation, somehow both respectful and heartbreaking, this careful distance he maintained as though she were a skittish creature that might bolt if approached too directly, and she accepted because refusal felt like giving power to the past rather than stepping toward whatever future they might construct from the ruins of their beginning. Though when she entered the vast dining room with its gleaming mahogany table set for two at one end, she felt the full awkwardness of their situation. This enforced intimacy between two people who were legally bound yet essentially strangers, who had wounded each other in ways that left scars still tender to the touch. The first several dinners were exercises in painful politeness, conversations that skated across safe surfaces without dipping into the depths of anything that mattered, discussions of weather and estate business and the quality of the cook's latest attempts at French cuisine, and Celestia found herself exhausted by the effort of maintaining pleasant neutrality, of neither retreating into cold silence nor pushing too hard toward a warmth that felt premature. But gradually, as days became weeks, something shifted almost imperceptibly. Adrian began sharing stories of his travels through Italy before their marriage, descriptions of Venetian sunsets and Roman ruins, delivered with an animation she had never witnessed in him before, and she found herself responding with observations about art and color theory, the way light transformed ordinary scenes into something transcendent, and he listened with an attention that felt genuinely interested rather than merely dutiful. One afternoon he appeared at the East Wing with two footmen carrying crates of art supplies, oils and watercolors, and canvas in quantities that spoke of serious intention rather than token gesture, and he informed her that the old conservatory on the south side of the manor was being converted into a proper studio with northern light and space for her to work. This offering made hesitantly, as though he feared she might reject it as too little too late, but she accepted with genuine gratitude because painting had been her salvation during confinement, and the prospect of creating with purpose, rather than merely to pass empty hours, felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had thought lost. The garden became their meeting place without either explicitly suggesting it, both drawn to the emerging spring blooms and the neutrality of outdoor space that belonged to neither of them exclusively, and there among the carefully tended beds of early roses and the ancient oak that had witnessed centuries of Blackwood family history, They began the slow work of learning who they actually were beneath the roles that circumstances had forced upon them, two damaged people attempting to build something real from the fragments of a marriage that had nearly destroyed them both. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, when a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest rolled up the curved drive to Thornfield Manor, and Celestia watched from her studio window as an elegantly dressed woman of middle years emerged with the imperious bearing of someone accustomed to having doors opened before she reached them, and Mrs. Hartwell appeared moments later to inform her that Lady Margaret Winters, her mother's elder sister, had arrived demanding an immediate audience with the Duchess, this aunt, whom Celestia had not seen since her mother's funeral, who had objected strenuously to the arranged marriage and severed contact when her objections were overruled. Adrian received word of the visitor while reviewing accounts in his study, and his first instinct was to send the woman away, to protect Celestia from whatever accusations or recriminations her aunt had travelled from Hampshire to deliver. But then he remembered his wife's words about trust and freedom, the fundamental dignities he had denied her for too long, and instead he sent word to Celestia, asking if she wished to receive her aunt, leaving the choice entirely in her hands, and when she agreed, he had Lady Margaret shown to the blue drawing-room with full courtesy, and informed Celestia he would be present for the interview if she desired, but absent if she preferred, and she asked him to stay, not because she feared her aunt, but because she wanted him to witness whatever transpired, to see her defend herself if defense became necessary. Lady Margaret swept into the drawing-room with eyes that immediately catalogued every detail: her niece's appearance, the Duke's positioning near the window, the subtle tension that hung between them like morning fog, and she wasted no time on pleasantries, demanding to know whether the rumors that had reached her were true, whether Celestia had been confined to isolated chambers for months, whether she was being held against her will under the guise of medical treatment, and Celestia felt Adrian tense beside her, preparing to defend himself, or perhaps to accept whatever judgment was pronounced. But before he could speak, she raised her hand slightly and addressed her aunt with a composure that surprised even herself, explaining that, yes, she had been confined. Yes, her husband had made a grievous error born of fear rather than malice, but that the situation had changed, that Adrian had educated himself about her condition and unlocked every door, that she remained at Thornfield now by choice rather than compulsion, building something new from the ashes of their disastrous beginning. And she watched her aunt's face cycle through disbelief, skepticism, and finally reluctant acceptance as she recognized the truth in her niece's steady gaze. Lady Margaret turned to Adrian with an expression that could have frozen summer wine and informed him that she had expected to find a tyrant and a monster, that she had come prepared to remove her niece by force if necessary, but that she could see Celestia spoke of her own free will, though she added with steel in her voice that should he ever give her cause to return under similar circumstances, he would discover that maternal family connections could prove remarkably inconvenient for a duke who valued his own reputation, and Adrian accepted this veiled threat with a bow of acknowledgement, recognizing it as both warning and conditional approval, the nearest thing to forgiveness he was likely to receive from a woman who had watched her sister die and her niece suffer. The visit concluded with cool civility, and Lady Margaret's departure left an odd silence in its wake. Celestia and Adrian standing together in the drawing-room, watching the carriage disappear down the drive, and finally Adrian turned to her and said quietly that she had defended him when she had every right to condemn him, that she had claimed choice when she could have claimed imprisonment and secured her escape, and he wanted to know why, what had prompted such unexpected grace, and Celestia considered the question carefully before responding that she had defended the truth as she understood it, that yes, he had wounded her deeply, but he had also worked to make amends in ways that felt genuine, that she remained because she chose to see whether they might build something real from this fractured foundation, not because the past was forgiven, but because the present held possibility. And that evening in the garden, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they sat together on the stone bench beneath the ancient oak and had their first truly vulnerable conversation, not about practical matters or careful pleasantries, but about the fear that had driven him to imprison her. The loss of his sister that had taught him love meant inevitable pain, and her own fear of being defined solely by her condition, reduced to her seizures rather than seen as a complete person. And they spoke of the possibility of beginning again, not pretending the past had not happened, but choosing deliberately to step toward each other, despite everything that had tried to push them apart. And when his hand brushed hers on the weathered stone, she did not pull away, but let her fingers curl tentatively around his. This small gesture of connection that felt more significant than any grand declaration, a fragile bridge built across the chasm that had divided them, and overhead the first stars emerged as witnesses to this quiet moment of transformation. Two people damaged by circumstance, finally brave enough to reach for something that resembled hope. Summer arrived at Thornfield like a benediction, the gardens exploding into riotous bloom, and the manor itself seeming to shed the heaviness that had clung to its stones through the long months of winter and spring. And with the warm weather came a transformation in the routines that had governed Celestia and Adrian's careful reconstruction, and their tentative friendship deepening into something that resembled partnership, as they began engaging in activities together beyond their quiet dinners and garden conversations, beginning with morning rides through the estate, where Adrian kept his stallion to a careful pace beside Celestia's mare, ever mindful of her condition, but no longer treating her as though she might shatter at any moment. And she appreciated this balance between care and trust, the way he had learned to protect without imprisoning, to worry without controlling. They attended the village church together on Sundays, where the congregation whispered behind gloved hands about the Duke's wife finally emerged from her mysterious seclusion, and Celestia handled their barely concealed curiosity, with a grace that impressed even the vicar's notoriously judgmental wife, answering polite inquiries about her health, with pleasant vagueness that satisfied social requirements without inviting deeper interrogation, and Adrian watched her navigate these interactions with something that might have been pride or perhaps relief that she possessed the strength to face a world that loved nothing more than a scandal to dissect. In early June they hosted their first dinner party, a small gathering of neighboring gentry that Celestia had initially resisted before deciding that hiding would only feed speculation, and she presided over the evening with a quiet dignity that reminded Adrian forcefully of why he had first been drawn to her during their brief courtship, before fear had poisoned everything. And when Lady Pemberton asked with false sweetness about her long recovery, Celestia simply smiled and said she was quite well now, and wasn't it lovely that summer had finally arrived, deflecting with such skill that even the most determined gossip could find no purchase for rumors. The defining moment came during a garden party in late June, when Celestia felt the familiar warning signs of an approaching seizure, that particular sensation like storm clouds gathering at the edges of her consciousness, and she caught Adrian's eye across the lawn where he stood discussing agricultural innovations with the local squire, and he excused himself immediately but calmly, coming to her side without obvious alarm, and together they walked toward a quieter corner of the garden as though simply seeking shade. And when the seizure took her there among the rose bushes with a dozen guests within view, Adrian remained beside her with such steady composure, supporting her gently and speaking to her in low, reassuring tones, that the handful of guests who noticed seemed uncertain whether anything untoward had even occurred, and afterward, when she recovered, he helped her to a garden bench and sent a footman for water, as though this were the most ordinary occurrence imaginable, his calm response doing more to normalize her condition in society's eyes than 1,000 explanations could have achieved. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the quality of their interactions, conversations that lingered longer than necessary, and his hand at her elbow, when they walked that remained even after she was steady, the way her fingers would brush his when passing him a book, and neither would immediately pull away. These small intimacies, accumulating like interest on an investment they had both been too afraid to acknowledge. And Celestia found herself watching him in unguarded moments, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair when he worked at his desk by the window, the rare smile that transformed his usually stern features into something approaching boyish when he was genuinely amused, and she recognized with something between wonder and trepidation that the companionship they had built was transforming into something warmer, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of love. And this emotion she had convinced herself she would never feel for the man who had imprisoned her. Yet here it was, fragile and new and terrifying in its possibility, growing in the space where pain had been, tentative green shoots emerging from scorched earth. The emotional breakthrough arrived on a night in late July, when summer storms rolled across the countryside with biblical fury, thunder shaking the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor, and lightning illuminating the gardens in stark white flashes that turned familiar landscapes, strange and terrible, and Celestia had been working in her studio when the first claps of thunder announced the tempest's arrival, but she had grown so absorbed in capturing the particular quality of evening light on water that she failed to notice the gathering darkness until rain began lashing against the windows with such violence that the glass seemed to bow inward, and the storm's intensity triggered something primal in her nervous system. The atmospheric pressure, or perhaps simply the overwhelming sensory assault, combining with exhaustion to bring on a seizure more severe than any she had experienced in months, and she had only moments to register the familiar warning signs before consciousness fragmented, and she fell among her scattered brushes and half-finished canvases. Unaware that Adrian had been crossing the hallway on his way to find her, when he heard the crash of her easel toppling, that he reached her studio door just as the seizure took full hold, and this time, instead of the careful, measured response he had cultivated, he simply acted on instinct, gathering her into his arms with a tenderness born of something deeper than duty or even friendship, supporting her head against his chest and murmuring words she could not hear but would remember later as echoes of comfort in the darkness. And he remained there holding her through the storm's fury as rain drummed overhead and thunder rolled like artillery across the heavens, not caring that paint smeared across his shirt or that his carefully maintained composure cracked and fell away, leaving only raw concern. And when she finally surfaced back into consciousness, it was to find herself cradled against him in the growing quiet after the storm's passage, her cheek pressed to his heartbeat while his hand moved soothingly through her hair. And for a long moment neither spoke, the intimacy of the position rendering words inadequate, until finally Celestia whispered that she was sorry. She did not know what she was apologizing for, except perhaps for being broken in ways he had not bargained for, and Adrian made a sound halfway between a laugh and something closer to a sob, and told her she had nothing to apologize for, that if anyone should beg forgiveness, it was him for all the months he had wasted in fear when he might have been here, holding her exactly like this, and something in his voice made her pull back enough to see his face properly, finding there an expression of such naked longing and regret that her breath caught, and she heard herself say what she had been trying not to acknowledge for weeks, that despite everything, despite the imprisonment and the pain and all the reasons she should feel nothing but resentment, she had begun to care for him, truly care in ways that terrified her, because caring made her vulnerable, and she had promised herself never to be vulnerable to him again. And Adrian closed his eyes as though her words caused physical pain before confessing in a voice rough with emotion that he had fallen in love with her during their brief courtship, that he had recognized in her something he had thought lost to him forever, the possibility of genuine connection beyond duty or alliance. But when he witnessed her first seizure, all his carefully buried grief over his sister's death had erupted, and he had convinced himself that loving her meant losing her, that isolation would somehow protect them both from the inevitable tragedy he believed illness brought. And only in these months of slowly knowing her had he understood that he had created the very tragedy he feared, that he had locked away not just her body but both their hearts, building walls when he should have been building bridges. And they acknowledged then the painful irony that they had both been prisoners, she to stone walls and locked doors, he to fear and grief that had calcified around his heart like armor. And when he asked quietly whether she thought they might truly begin their marriage, not the hollow arrangement they had started with, but something real and chosen, she considered the question with the seriousness it deserved before answering simply, slowly, this single word containing both permission and warning, an acknowledgement that trust once shattered could be rebuilt, but only with patience and care, and he accepted this with a nod that might have been gratitude or relief, or perhaps both. And as the last of the storm clouds cleared and moonlight began filtering through the studio windows, he helped her to her feet, and they stood together, among the scattered evidence of her art, two people finally brave enough to reach for something that resembled love, however fragile, however hard-won, however uncertain the path ahead might prove to be. Autumn returned to Thornfield Manor with the same golden light and crisp air that had marked Celestia's arrival 1 year prior. But this October morning found her preparing for something she had once thought impossible, a journey away from the estate that had been both her prison and eventually her sanctuary. And Adrian had proposed the excursion to the seaside with careful casualness over breakfast 3 weeks earlier, watching her face for signs of reluctance or fear. But Celestia had surprised them both by agreeing immediately. Recognizing that this trip represented more than mere travel, it was a test of the fragile trust they had rebuilt, a declaration that she was no longer confined by walls or by the weight of their painful history. And as their carriage rolled through the countryside toward the coast, she watched the landscape transform from familiar woodland to open farmland, to the peculiar flatness that preceded the sea, feeling something in her chest loosen with each mile that carried them farther from Thornfield's shadow. And Adrian sat across from her, maintaining a careful distance that she appreciated even as part of her, wished he would sit beside her, close enough to share warmth. But they were still learning this dance of intimacy, still discovering what permission looked like between two people who had begun as strangers bound by duty, and were now tentatively reaching towards something that resembled choice. The seaside village of Whitecliff proved to be a charming collection of weathered cottages, clinging to chalk cliffs that dropped dramatically to a beach of smooth grey stones, and Adrian had secured them rooms at a respectable inn overlooking the water, separate chambers connected by a sitting room in deference to the careful boundaries they were still navigating. And Celestia stood at her window, that first evening, watching gulls wheel against a sky painted in shades of amber and rose, breathing in the salt air that tasted of freedom and possibility. And she heard Adrian's knock at the connecting door, his quiet question of whether she might join him for a walk along the beach before darkness fell completely, and together they descended the narrow path that switchbacked down the cliff face, Adrian offering his hand at the steeper portions and Celestia taking it without hesitation. This simple touch, now familiar enough to feel natural, yet still carrying the charge of newness. And when they reached the beach proper, she removed her shoes, as she had done as a girl, feeling the cool, smooth stones beneath her feet and laughing at Adrian's startled expression before he followed suit. This duke, who had always been so concerned with propriety, now walking barefoot beside her, like a schoolboy on holiday, and they wandered for hours as the sun sank lower, collecting shells that caught their fancy, watching the tide's inexorable advance, speaking of everything and nothing, their conversation flowing with an ease that would have seemed impossible mere months ago. And Celestia found herself telling him about her mother, the woman who had taught her to hide her seizures as though they were shameful secrets rather than simple medical fact. And Adrian listened without judgment before sharing his own memories of his sister's final days, the helpless rage of watching someone beloved slip away despite every prayer and physician's intervention. And in this exchange of old griefs they found unexpected lightness. The weight of unspoken history finally lifted through the simple act of honest sharing. On their third evening at Whitecliff, they sat on the beach watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, that particular quality of coastal light that seems to set the very air ablaze. And Celestia felt the moment crystallize into something significant, one of those instants that would later serve as a marker between before and after. And she turned to find Adrian already watching her with an expression of such careful hope that her heart ached with the tenderness of it, and she reached out deliberately and took his hand, not for support or assistance, but simply because she wanted to. This gesture of choosing connection rather than accepting help, and his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that acknowledged the gift she was offering, and they sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised purple and gold. And when full darkness began gathering, Celestia found herself asking, her voice barely audible above the waves, whether he might kiss her, not as duty or obligation, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by someone she was beginning to love. And Adrian's breath caught audibly before he turned to face her fully, cupping her face with both hands as though she was something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And when his lips met hers, it was with a tenderness that held within it both apology for all the months of pain and promise for whatever future they might build together, gentle and questioning, and full of a hope that terrified them both in its fragility. And Celestia leaned into the kiss, into him, into the possibility that what had begun in darkness might yet find its way toward light. And when they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of this second chance. and she told him quietly that perhaps they might simply spend it learning to be worthy of each other. This more honest acknowledgement that redemption was not his alone to seek but theirs to build together. And as they walked back up the cliff path, hand in hand, beneath a sky full of emerging stars, Celestia understood that they were finally, truly beginning their marriage. Not with vows spoken in a church before witnesses who meant nothing, but here on this beach, with only the eternal witness of the sea, choosing each other with full knowledge of the pain they had caused and the possibility they might yet claim, if they were brave enough, patient enough, honest enough to try. Their return to Thornfield Manor in late October carried the weight of transformation, the familiar stone walls and autumn-painted gardens appearing somehow softer than when they had departed, as though the estate itself had shifted in their absence to accommodate the fragile new understanding they had brought back with them. And Celestia stood in the entrance hall breathing in the scent of beeswax and wood smoke, while Adrian spoke quietly with Mrs. Hartwell about arrangements he had set in motion during their journey, and the housekeeper's knowing smile suggested she understood more than was said about what had transpired at the seaside. And when Celestia asked what arrangements he meant, Adrian took her hand with the easy intimacy they had begun practicing and led her through familiar corridors to the east wing, in those rooms that had been her prison for so many terrible months, and she felt her steps slow involuntarily as old memories threatened to surface. But when he opened the doors, she found the space utterly transformed, walls knocked through to create a vast, light-filled gallery where her easel stood, waiting beside tall windows that had been enlarged to flood the space with natural illumination, and scattered throughout the room were her paintings from the months of confinement. Those desperate landscapes of gardens she could only observe and horizons she could not reach, now hung with care and dignity as though they were treasures rather than evidence of suffering. And Adrian explained quietly that he wanted this space reclaimed, wanted her to fill it with new art that spoke of freedom rather than captivity, wanted the East Wing to become not a reminder of his failures, but a testament to her strength and the beauty she created even in darkness. And Celestia found herself unable to speak for several moments, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of this gesture, the understanding it demonstrated of what she needed to heal fully, and when she finally turned to him, she saw uncertainty in his expression, as though he feared he had overstepped or presumed too much. But she silenced his worry with a kiss that held gratitude and affection, and the growing certainty that what they were building together might actually endure. The days that followed established new rhythms that felt both deliberate and natural, morning breaking with them sharing breakfast in the small dining room rather than the formal hall, Adrian reading correspondence while Celestia sketched ideas for paintings, and they discussed the day ahead with the comfortable intimacy of genuine partnership. And afterwards, she would retreat to her gallery to work while he attended to estate business, but often he would appear mid-morning with tea and stay to watch her paint, asking questions about technique and color that demonstrated real interest rather than mere politeness. And he commissioned her to create a series of paintings for the manor's public rooms, landscapes and portraits that would replace the dark ancestral portraits that had made the house feel like a mausoleum. And Celestia threw herself into this work with joy, finally able to contribute something meaningful to the estate that had been both prison and eventually home. And their evenings were spent in the library where they had begun reading aloud to each other, taking turns with novels and poetry, their voices filling the quiet with stories of other lives and other loves, while the fire crackled and outside the November winds began their annual assault on Thornfield's ancient stones. What surprised Celestia most in these weeks was the emergence of playfulness between them, moments of levity she had never imagined possible with the stern Duke who had locked her away, and it began small, with Adrian making a dry observation about a pompous neighbor that made her laugh unexpectedly, and her laughter seemed to unlock something in him, and soon they were trading witticisms over dinner and engaging in spirited debates about art and literature that sometimes grew so animated the servants would pause outside the dining room to listen with barely concealed amusement, and once when she was painting in the garden and he was supposed to be reviewing accounts, he appeared instead and confessed. He found estate ledgers unbearably dull compared to watching her work, and she had teased him about neglecting his ducal duties until he captured her paint-stained hands and pulled her close and told her she was the only duty that mattered anymore. and the servants who witnessed these small intimacies began whispering among themselves that their Duke and Duchess were finally, truly falling in love. And Mrs. Hartwell would smile knowingly when she observed them walking hand in hand through the gardens or sitting close together in the library, and even stern Mr. Pemberton, the butler, was heard to remark that the house felt more alive now than it had in all his years of service, as though Thornfield itself was breathing easier now that its master and mistress had found their way to each other through all the darkness and pain that had nearly destroyed them both. Winter descended upon Thornfield Manor with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the warmth now residing within its walls, and this December found the estate transformed from the silent mausoleum it had been the previous year into something that resembled an actual home, with garlands of evergreen adorning the staircases and the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifting from the kitchens where Mrs. Hartwell supervised preparations for the first proper Christmas celebration Thornfield had seen in decades, and Adrian had proposed hosting family and close friends with an uncertainty that touched Celestia deeply, asking if she felt ready to face society in this more intimate setting, and she had surprised herself by agreeing without hesitation, recognizing that she was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived here 14 months prior, but someone who had claimed her place in this house and in her marriage through hard-won understanding, and the guest chambers were opened and aired for the first time in years. Silver was polished until it gleamed, and preparations consumed the household with the kind of purposeful energy that spoke of genuine celebration rather than mere obligation. The Dowager Duchess arrived 3 days before Christmas in her customary black traveling coach, and Celestia felt her stomach tighten with old anxiety as she and Adrian stood in the entrance hall to greet his mother, this formidable woman who had urged him toward annulment during those dark months of confinement. But Adrian's hand found hers and squeezed gently in reassurance, and when the Dowager descended from her carriage, she observed their clasped hands with an expression Celestia could not immediately decipher, something that might have been surprise or perhaps cautious approval, and the older woman's greeting to Celestia was formal but not cold, a careful neutrality that suggested she was withholding judgment until she could assess what manner of marriage her son had actually built in her absence. The days leading to Christmas provided ample opportunity for such assessment, and Celestia was acutely aware of the Dowager's shrewd observation as she and Adrian moved through their daily routines, sharing breakfast with easy conversation, walking together in the frost-touched gardens, sitting close in the library as they discussed plans for the holiday festivities, and she noticed the older woman's expression shift gradually from skepticism to something approaching wonder, as she witnessed the genuine affection between them, the small touches and shared glances that spoke of intimacy earned rather than performed, and on the morning of Christmas Eve, the Dowager requested a private audience with Celestia in the small parlor, and Celestia steeled herself for criticism or interrogation, but instead found herself faced with something far more unexpected when Adrian's mother sat heavily in the chair by the fire and spoke quietly of her regret, how she had pressured Adrian toward annulment out of concern for the family name, without considering what her son actually wanted, how she had judged Celestia's condition as weakness without understanding its nature, and she asked forgiveness for her harshness with a dignity that made refusal impossible, and Celestia found herself offering that forgiveness with surprising ease, recognizing that the Dowager's fears had been born of love for her son, even if misguided in expression, and the two women emerged from that conversation, if not as friends, then at least as allies in their shared care for Adrian. And that evening, as the household gathered for Christmas Eve dinner, Celestia felt the weight of the past year lifting somehow, replaced by the tentative hope that they were finally, truly, becoming a family. After the meal, Adrian drew Celestia aside to his study with barely contained excitement, presenting her with a leather-bound volume that she initially thought was a book until she opened it to discover a medical journal article, commissioned research on seizure disorders and their management during pregnancy and beyond, and he explained, with the careful diffidence of someone offering a gift they feared might be inadequate, that he had been funding this research for months, working with physicians in London and Edinburgh to advance understanding of her condition. And Celestia found herself unable to speak for several moments as she paged through the article, overwhelmed not by the information itself, but by what this gesture represented. His continued commitment to understanding rather than fearing her seizures, His determination to ensure she received proper care built on knowledge rather than superstition, and when she finally looked up at him with tears threatening, she saw uncertainty in his expression, as though he still doubted his right to offer her such things after all the pain he had caused, and she set the journal aside carefully and took his face between her hands and told him that this was the most precious gift anyone had ever given her, not because of the research itself, but because it demonstrated that he truly saw her, truly understood what she needed to feel safe and valued, and he pulled her close and whispered against her hair that he would spend the rest of his life learning to deserve the second chance she had given him. And she reminded him gently that they were giving each other that chance, that redemption was not his burden alone, but something they were building together through patience and honesty, and the courage to keep choosing each other despite everything that had nearly destroyed them both. Spring arrived at Thornfield Manor with an explosion of color that seemed to celebrate the transformation the estate had undergone. Daffodils and crocuses pushing through the still cold earth, while the orchards burst into clouds of pink and white blossoms, and it was during this season of renewal that Celestia discovered she was carrying Adrian's child, the realization coming first as a suspicion when her monthly courses failed to arrive, and then as a certainty confirmed by Dr. Whitmore, whose examination brought both congratulations and careful warnings about managing her condition during pregnancy. And when she told Adrian that evening in the library, his reaction was everything she had hoped for and feared simultaneously, joy blazing across his features before being tempered by visible terror, and she watched him struggle to master his emotions, to not let his old fears overwhelm this moment that should be purely happy. And he took her hands and asked with careful steadiness what the physicians had said about safety, about risks. And she explained that Dr. Whitmore, along with the London specialists Adrian had consulted, all agreed that pregnancy was possible with proper monitoring and care, that her seizures might actually decrease during these months, or they might not, and that there were no guarantees, but neither were there insurmountable obstacles. And Adrian nodded slowly, and she could see him deliberately choosing not to imprison her again in the name of protection, choosing instead to trust the medical knowledge he had worked so hard to obtain and to trust her own understanding of her body. And he pulled her close and whispered that they would face this together as they had learned to face everything, with honesty and patience and the hard-won courage to hope for joy rather than brace only for loss. The months that followed were marked by a delicate balance between caution and celebration, Adrian protective but not smothering, having learned through painful experience the difference between care and control, and he accompanied her to weekly consultations with Dr. Whitmore, asking detailed questions about symptoms and warning signs, ensuring the household staff understood what might be needed should she experience a seizure, but he never suggested she curtail her activities beyond reasonable accommodation, never implied she should retreat into fearful isolation, and Celestia found herself painting with renewed inspiration, choosing the nursery as her canvas and covering its walls with murals of gardens and meadows and skies full of birds, wanting their child to enter a world of beauty and freedom rather than the darkness she had once known, and they spent long evenings discussing names, Adrian favoring classical choices, while Celestia preferred something that spoke of new beginnings, and gradually they built a list of possibilities that they would test against each other, like trying on garments to see what fit, and as her body changed and swelled with the life growing within her, she noticed that her seizures did indeed become less frequent, whether from the hormonal shifts of pregnancy or from the profound happiness that had replaced the stress and loneliness of previous years, and she chose to believe it was both, that her body and spirit were working together to nurture this new life, and Adrian would place his hand on her belly in the evenings and speak softly to their unborn child, telling stories of Thornfield's history and making promises about the love that awaited. And Celestia would watch him in these moments and see the complete healing of the man who had once locked her away out of fear, transformed now into someone who understood that love was not about protection through isolation, but about facing uncertainty, together with open hearts and joined hands. And when summer arrived and her time drew near, they were both terrified and elated, aware that they stood at the threshold of something that would either crown their hard-won happiness or test them in ways they could not yet imagine, but ready nevertheless to meet whatever came with the strength they had built together. Through all the darkness and pain and gradual dawning of understanding, that had brought them finally to this moment of shared anticipation and hope. Summer arrived at Thornfield Manor with a heat that seemed to mirror the intensity of waiting, and as July deepened into August, Celestia found herself moving through the final weeks of her confinement with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension that made sleep elusive and every small twinge a possible harbinger of labor, and Adrian had become more attentive than ever without crossing into the suffocating protectiveness she had once endured, asking each morning how she had slept and whether she needed anything, but trusting her to know her own body and its signals. And Dr. Whitmore had taken up semi-permanent residence in one of the guest chambers, along with a midwife from London, whose reputation for managing difficult births had impressed even the cautious physician, and when Celestia's pains began on a sweltering afternoon in mid-August, she recognized them immediately for what they were: the tightening across her belly that started as discomfort and gradually intensified into something that demanded her complete attention, and she sent Lily to fetch Adrian and the medical team, with a calmness that surprised her, given the enormity of what was beginning. And Adrian appeared within minutes, his face pale but determined, and when she told him the baby was coming, he nodded once and took her hand, and announced with quiet defiance of every social convention that he would not leave her. If that propriety be damned, he had failed her once by absence, and would not repeat that mistake. Now, when she faced this trial, and she gripped his hand gratefully as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent, transforming from manageable discomfort into waves of pain that seemed to consume her entire being, and the hours that followed blurred into a haze of effort and exhaustion, punctuated by Adrian's steady presence at her side, his voice offering encouragement when she thought she could not continue, his hand becoming her anchor as she rode each contraction like a storm that threatened to pull her under, and she was dimly aware of Dr. Whitmore's calm instructions and the midwife's practiced efficiency, but mostly she was aware of Adrian, this man who had once locked her away in fear, now refusing to abandon her in her most vulnerable moment, and when the final stages of labor arrived and the pain reached heights she had not imagined possible, she heard herself crying out and felt Adrian's lips against her forehead, whispering that she was strong, that she could do this, that he was here and would not let go. And then, with a final tremendous effort, their daughter entered the world, her first cry piercing the air like a pronouncement of triumph, and Celestia felt tears streaming down her face as the midwife placed the tiny, perfect infant against her chest. This miracle they had created together, and she looked up at Adrian to find him weeping openly as he gazed at their daughter with an expression of such wonder and relief and overwhelming love that she knew in that moment his healing was complete, and that the terrified boy who had watched his sister die had been finally laid to rest and replaced by this man who had just witnessed life instead of death, hope instead of loss. And when he bent to kiss first their daughter's head and then Celestia's lips, she tasted salt and joy in equal measure. And later, when they had been cleaned and settled, and the medical team had confirmed mother and child, both healthy, Adrian sat beside the bed holding their daughter with a tenderness that made Celestia's heart ache with happiness, and she watched him trace the baby's tiny features with one finger and whisper welcome to Eleanor Rose, named for his lost sister and for the flower that symbolized love and new beginnings. And Celestia understood that this birth had delivered them all, herself from the shadow of her confinement, and Adrian from the prison of his fear, and their daughter into a world where she would be cherished, not despite vulnerability, but with full understanding that fragility and strength could coexist. And as the summer evening deepened outside their windows, and the three of them rested in the quiet aftermath of creation, Celestia reflected that they were no longer simply Duke and Duchess, bound by arrangement and obligation, but partners who had chosen each other through every dark moment and emerged transformed, their love not diminished by the trials they had endured, but deepened and made more precious precisely because it had been tested and proven true. 5 years had passed since Eleanor Rose's birth, and Thornfield Manor had been transformed into something its ancient stones had perhaps never witnessed before, a place of genuine joy and laughter, where the echoes of past sorrows had been replaced by the sounds of children playing in gardens that once stood silent and austere. And Celestia stood now in the East Wing Gallery on an October afternoon, the same wing where she had once been imprisoned, but which Adrian had meticulously renovated into a light-filled exhibition space for her art, and she gazed at the paintings that lined its walls. Her Freedom series, as the London critics had named it, canvases that documented her journey from captivity through darkness into the light of hard-won love. Each brushstroke a testament to pain acknowledged and overcome, and she could hear through the open windows the delighted shrieks of Eleanor, now 5 years old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's artistic temperament, chasing her younger brother Thomas through the rose garden, while Adrian's deeper voice called playful warnings about the fountain, and Celestia smiled at the domestic symphony that had become the music of her days, so different from the silence that had once threatened to consume her. And she thought about how the gallery had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visitors from London coming to see the Duchess of Thornfield's remarkable paintings, but also to hear the whispered story of transformation, how the Duke, who had once locked his wife away, had become her greatest champion, funding the Blackwood Foundation for neurological research that had already made significant advances in understanding and treating conditions like hers. And she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Adrian entering the gallery, Thomas perched on his shoulders and Eleanor clinging to his hand, all three of them flushed from the autumn air and radiating the kind of happiness that cannot be feigned. And Adrian met her eyes across the room, and she saw in his gaze everything they had built together, the choice they made every day to continue choosing each other, despite the painful beginning. The commitment to honesty and patience that had allowed love to grow in soil that seemed too damaged to nurture anything beautiful, and Eleanor ran to her, calling, "Mama, Papa says you'll paint our portraits for the new gallery in London." And Celestia gathered her daughter close and confirmed this was true, that her work would be exhibited in the Royal Academy next spring, a recognition that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of confinement. And as her family surrounded her in this space that had once represented her imprisonment but now symbolized her freedom, Celestia felt the profound satisfaction of a life reclaimed and remade through courage and the willingness to believe in second chances. Dear listener, perhaps you have learned, as Celestia and Adrian did, that the beginning of a story does not determine its ending, and that the wounds we carry and the mistakes we make need not define us. If we possess the courage to face them honestly and the patience to allow healing its necessary time, for love is not discovered in perfect circumstances or unblemished pasts, but rather in the deliberate choice to see beyond surfaces to the struggling soul beneath, to offer forgiveness when it is asked for with genuine remorse, and to build together something stronger than what might have existed had the path been smooth from the start. And if you find yourself in darkness, whether of your own making or another's, know that transformation is always possible for those willing to undertake the difficult work of change, that walls built from fear can be dismantled stone by stone and replaced with bridges of understanding, and that the deepest love often grows not despite adversity but because of it, strengthened by every challenge overcome and every choice to remain when leaving would be easier. So may you find the courage to be honest about your own struggles and the grace to meet others' vulnerabilities with compassion rather than judgment. May you recognize that healing is not a destination but a journey undertaken one day at a time, with patience and hope. And may you discover, as Celestia did, that freedom is found not in the absence of difficulty, but in the presence of someone who chooses to walk beside you through every storm. And may your nights be peaceful, and your heart be open to the possibility of love that redeems and restores and makes all things new. Like and subscribe to Everlasting Love Stories for more tales of transformation and enduring love.